Well, I've talked before about how each generation loves to turn on the art of the previous generation, but Rococo generated a response within its own generation, from a middle class and sometimes aristocratic intelligentsia that was repelled by the frivolity and sensuality of Rococo art. This painting is Dahveed's Death of Socrates. Socrates, of course, is the most famous advocate of using reason to achieve both wisdom and virtue. The Athenian government accused Socrates of denying the gods and corrupting the youth through his teachings, and they offered him a choice of renouncing his beliefs or dying by drinking a cup of hemlock. Socrates chose the hemlock, after discoursing for a while with his grief-stricken disciples. Dahveed is the most famous neoclassical painter, and we won't take him up until my next lecture. But let's stop for a minute and study this painting, which is not a required work. First, in what way does this resemble and not resemble a Baroque painting? Well, I'll quickly flash through a couple of Baroque paintings from last unit just to stimulate your thinking. As always, I wish I could hear what you said. What struck me as a similarity above all is that the painting is highly staged, maybe too staged. To me, it lacks a sense of movement. It's almost as if the director called out freeze at a critical moment when Socrates is about to take that first deadly sip. Caravaggio captures moments too, but I think my guy makes it a lot more plausible that Matthew is about to get out of his seat and walk out the door with Jesus. So what about the theme of this painting? It's very serious. In this way, Dahveed represents a return to the Baroque, and if anything, he ramps it up a level. Dahveed's heroes are very often in the process of giving up their lives, or often somebody else's lives, for a cause. But note that this is not a religious cause. Socrates is sacrificing his life for reason and virtue. The French Revolution will revolt against Catholicism and Christianity as well. But clearly there's nothing Rococo here. Nobody's wearing pink. In fact, no girls allowed, which, as we saw with Vigée Lebrun, was rather the view of French revolutionary thinkers. So let's watch a brief clip from the Art of the Western World series, introducing French Enlightenment thinkers, or philosophes. So, as I mentioned in my last lecture, the 16th century had witnessed hugely important scientific discoveries. Isaac Newton, for example, first published his laws of motion in 1687. In the 1700s, that is the 18th century, a new generation of thinkers attempted to apply this science to political and to social life, an effort that would eventually help spark revolutions in America and in France. Meanwhile, a new generation of scientists and inventors was applying these new scientific discoveries to economic production, and that helped bring about the Industrial Revolution. Now, I assume I have totally appalled Ms. Jacobs, who is a scholar of the Enlightenment, which I've just tried to sum up in 2 sentences. So here's today's first required work. This British painting really captures the spirit of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. The philosopher is demonstrating an orrery. That's a device that illustrates how planets revolve around the sun. And it's also an exercise that gives an artist a chance to imitate what earlier artist altogether now? Caravaggio, of course. The answer always seems to be Caravaggio. Anyway, let's compare this with the Calling of Matthew. What's the most obvious similarity? Well, right clearly employs stark tenebrism. And what's the big difference? So I don't know what you just said, but what strikes me is that in this painting we see the source of light, and it's part of the mechanism itself. Man-made, scientific, even industrial. Caravaggio's light is more ambiguous. It's probably coming from an open window, but maybe, just maybe, it's coming from Christ himself. Note the painting's emphasis on the reforming power of education. We see 2 children totally fascinated by this exercise. I also think it's interesting that Wright seems to have allowed a woman to witness this scene. This is a painting stripped of religion's mystery, but I think it imbues science with some of religion's power to convert, to transform, and to entrance. In place of St. Teresa or St. Matthew transformed by a direct vision, we have ordinary people, especially children, transfixed by science. Darby is often described as the first painter of the Industrial Revolution, although I think his subject is as much the scientific revolution. Many of his paintings feature influential scientists and industrialists. So here's another Wright painting, and it's quite similar to our required work, so it could be a candidate for an attribution question. The painting depicts a natural philosopher, a forerunner of the modern scientist, recreating one of Robert Boyle's air pump experiments. A bird is being deprived of air. The onlookers display a variety of reactions, but for the most part they seem more curious than overcome with concern for the bird. Wright himself hailed from Derbyshire in northern England, where coal and iron were beginning to transform the British economy. He trained in London, but he worked in the Midlands most of his life, and the new industrialists of that region were among his most enthusiastic customers. Two of his most important patrons were Josiah Wedgwood, who's credited with industrializing the manufacture of pottery, and Richard Arkwright, who basically created the factory system for manufacturing cotton cloth. It's easy to understand why he was popular with industrialists. He imbues science and industry with a dignity and reverence that had usually been reserved for religious or history paintings. So here's one last Wright painting, this one capturing a specific process of the early Industrial Revolution. Note again the chiaroscuro, but also a man-made source of light. And note how sympathetically he portrays laborers. We're going to see more of that toward the end of this unit. Just a reminder, the early 18th century work also displays a fascination with empiricism, appropriate for the daughter of a scientist. And so does this Costa painting. Even in this case, I hope we all find the racial empiricism a little creepy. Remember that this was displayed not in an art museum, but in a museum of natural history. Next required work. So the story behind this painting and this woman is a little more complicated, although it clearly belongs in the Enlightenment. The painting itself is a fairly conventional Baroque portrait, but there are some important differences. So here's another painting of Sor Juana, which now hangs in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. The museum website, by the way, has this interesting notation. The inscription identifies the image as a, quote, faithful, unquote, copy after a portrait, quote, that she herself made and painted with her own hand. Note that both paintings prominently feature her nun's badge with its depiction of the Annunciation. We also see a combination of religious and intellectual imagery. She's surrounded by books or carrying a book, and yet she's holding a rosary as well. The Khan Academy essay noted that the painting of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz is quite different from other nun paintings of the time, so I went on a nun painting hunt and found this one by the same artist from pretty much the same time. Score! Saint Gertrude, by the way, was a German nun and a medieval saint, not an Enlightenment figure. Instead, she was known for her spiritual exercises, a little along the lines of Saint Teresa. Note both nuns are portrayed with a book, although I'm guessing Saint Gertrude is reading a Bible, and it's a little anachronistic since the printing press had not been invented yet. Both are holding quill pens, signifying their status as writers. Both wear religious insignia. But what differences do you see? Well, the most obvious difference, it seems to me, is that Sor Juana Inés is looking right at us, rather as Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun does in her self-portrait. Couldn't find much more information about this painting of Sor Juana as a young girl, but the inscription indicates that's who she is, and it shows up on several websites about her. Sor Juana Inés was an illegitimate child of a Creole mother and a Spanish father, and she grew up on her mother's father's estate. Juana was a child prodigy who by her early teenage years was fluent in Greek, Latin, and I find this interesting, the native Aztec language, Nahuatl. She allegedly tried to disguise herself as a man to get admitted to university. Didn't work, so at 16 she joined the court of the Viceroy of New Spain, the Marquis de la Manchera, as one of his wife's ladies-in-waiting. When she was 17, the Viceroy assembled a panel of scholars to test her intelligence, and basically she turned out to be that year's Big Jeopardy winner. It probably didn't hurt that by all accounts, including this painting, she was beautiful as well as brilliant. But marriage was not a good path for someone interested in scholarship, so Juana instead entered a convent. Her order provided her with a study and a library, and they apparently valued her scholarship and literary skills. She became a famous but also a controversial poet. I posted one of her poems in translation. Given the rhymes, it's probably not a completely literal translation. So any guess about what made a controversy? Well, my lady is apparently the Viceroy's wife, not the Virgin Mary, and apparently there was also quite a bit of gossip about the nature of their relationship, which scholarship has not been able to confirm or deny. But what really got her into trouble was a letter, published without her consent, taking issue with a Jesuit priest who criticized her love poems in a sermon. She replied with a famous Respuesta, a reply. I've posted the English translation on Moodle. It is heavy-going, 34 single-spaced pages filled with mystical references and biblical allusions. But basically, she lays out her autobiography, including her early thirst for learning, and then goes on to defend women's education with examples from Scripture, Catholic teaching, and history. So I'm showing you my favorite paragraph, which is now my favorite summary of the Christian Enlightenment Creed. So how would you sum up what she says? I'd summarize it as, it is never an offense against God to study the universe he made, or myself, whom he also made. Note her use of the word machine. The machine analogy was common in Enlightenment thinking. Some scholars even talked about a clockwork universe where God started the world ticking and then basically left it alone. There's no indication other than that Sor Juana viewed the world or God that way. The story ends badly for our nun. The church required her to sell her books as well as all musical and scientific instruments. Sor Juana responded by devoting herself to a rigorous penance. She gave up all her studies and writing. In 1695, a plague hit the convent, and after tending to her fellow sisters, she died from the disease at around the age of 44. Just one last comment before we move on. I found this painting on a website for today's Latina artists. I couldn't find the artist's name. This too is an homage to Sor Juana, but what big difference do you notice between the two paintings? Well, the recent image of Sor Juana looks much more mestizo, a figure more readily identifiable as Mexican. Chances are the 18th century portraits are more accurate. Sor Juana's ancestry is recorded as Spanish and Creole, which means Spanish but born in the New World. But it's possible she had some indigenous ancestry. Some of the very highly ranking women in the Mexican court did, and her study of the Aztec language suggests an interest in that culture. Anyway, I thought it was intriguing. But it's too simple to summarize the Enlightenment as just the pursuit of reason and an empirical, factual exploration of the world. Yes, the philosophe Voltaire believed that reason should rule, especially over what he saw as the superstition and tyranny of the church. Rousseau, on the other hand, believed that men relied too heavily on reason and that they should trust their emotions. So this slide has a selection of Rousseau quotations on the subject of nature and civilization. Women, well, Rousseau thought they should stick with their emotions and stay out of politics and stay home with the kids, since those emotions made them unreliable participants in political discourse. We will see that this view pervades neoclassical art. But for now, note that a taste for naturalism shows up in the paintings of Vigée Lebrun. It's an important way she departs from more artificial Rococo artists. Rousseau was widely read and highly influential in the last days of the French aristocracy. Do you remember how Marie Antoinette liked to play act being a shepherdess? In art history terms, the trust in sentiment and feeling, the belief in nature, and a reaction against aristocratic immorality would produce a new wave of naturalistic paintings, most of which we aren't going to have time to look at. But here is an example of a genre painting depicting a simple rural family by a famous French painter who's dropped off the list. And our next required work. William Hogarth did not paint bucolic rural scenes, but he did reinforce moral attacks on a corrupt aristocracy in his brilliant caricatures. These, too, were very popular with the rising middle class, especially when they were reproduced in inexpensive engravings. So here we see the same image as an engraving. What might this story have to do with naturalism? Not a whole lot of natural stuff here. Actually, the unnatural nature of arranged marriages and the superiority of marriage based on love was a common theme in the literature of 18th century England. Marriage à la mode was in fact the title of a play by John Dryden, first performed in London in 1673, which, I'd note, is a century before Rousseau. So here's a comment from the Tate Gallery website. À la mode means something's merely fashionable and not enduring. kind of like ice cream on pie that melts. Thus, the marriage a la mode is, by definition, a travesty of marriage itself and part of the debate about marriage and sexual ethics that escalated from the late 17th century. The website and the Khan Academy video both also note that the paintings were a commentary on taste and on art connoisseurs. So here's an earlier Hogarth engraving of the same scene. Again, I'm going to read a little from the Tate Museum commentary. We see two effete connoisseurs in raptures over a tiny and seemingly insignificant cup and saucer. Meanwhile, a richly dressed lady examines another luxury item in her home, a black page boy in a turban. Significantly, a similar page boy figure appears in scene 4 of Marriage a la Mode, which involves an adulterous wife. And that's all for now, folks. Quite deliberately, your homework Khan Academy video included lots of interesting detail about Marriage a la Mode, and you'll learn more in the student presentation next class. I'm not going to spoil the presentation or save you the trouble of doing your homework. In my next lecture, I will return to Dahveed and also look at neoclassicism in the new United States of America.